In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains the relation between men, women, and becoming self-conscious.
Now more about the tree. Also there's the evolutionary tree. And the evolutionary tree has the snake in it. And the evolutionary tree also bears fruit. And you know that our color vision evolved to detect ripe fruit. And I think that part of the reason that Eve tempts Adam towards consciousness is because women shared fruit with men. And sharing food is a very, very weird thing. I mean, most mammals share food with their offspring, right? So mother mammals will share food with their infants. But human beings are very peculiar in that we'll share food with each other and we share food with strangers. And it's built into us. This isn't some cultural construct. Human beings share food. In fact, if we don't eat communally, our whole ability to regulate our eating goes astray and we get sick. And we know perfectly well that our vision evolved to detect ripe fruit, because one of the things we're really good at is detecting the difference between red and green. And the relationship between fruit and evolution and women and consciousness is so tight that even many of the attributes that men find beautiful in women are fruit-like attributes. So it's an old and deep association. And I think part of the reason that women, the way women tempted men towards self-consciousness is, imagine that you're more self-conscious if you're vulnerable. And so I think that the idea that women became self-conscious first is probably right. Because women, first of all, had to contend with the fact that they were small and easily damaged. But even more particularly, they had to contend with the fact that they had infants who were small and easily damaged. And I think that female nervous systems have actually evolved so that they're optimized for the female infant dyad and not for the female herself. Because you might ask, well, why are women more sensitive to negative emotion and higher in agreeableness than men? And it makes perfect sense. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it might be, but it particularly makes perfect sense if the nervous system that women are using is adapted so that it's responding to the world as if the woman is a dyad between her and her infant, which is exactly how she's going to have to act if she's going to get an infant from the age of, well, 0 to 4, certainly, but we could say from 0 to 14. It's a hell of a burden. It's the biggest maternal burden that any creature on the planet carries. And in some manner, women were able to entice men into dyadic pair bonds. And there's a variety of reasons why that might be. Some of the evolutionary biologists think it's because women are continually sexually available, which makes them unique among most animals, and certainly unique among primates, so that it made sense from a sexual perspective for a man to bind himself to one woman, because men are rather, they have a strong sex drive, and they tend towards, they certainly, as a general rule, want to have sexual relationships more often than the typical woman, but women are capable of doing that. And women share food, and women are gatherers. And so the idea that women enticed men into self-consciousness by sharing food with them strikes me as highly probable. That's an enticement. And I think that women did make men self-conscious, and I think they did it a whole bunch of ways. I mean, I think they first did it by making men more and more aware of how vulnerable women and children were, and drawing their attention to the fact that, in principle, that placed a moral responsibility on the man. You know, we think of that as self-evident now, but it's certainly not self-evident in the animal kingdom. So it's a particularly human discovery. And then I also think that women made men self-conscious by rejecting them constantly. And so what that also means is that women produced an evolutionary arms race, in some sense, among men and between men and women. Because one of the things we have to account for, you remember, is our incredibly rapid cortical growth. You know, and it seems to me that a whole variety of positive feedback loops got going at the same time, and that's what produced the tremendous increase in our cortical capacity, up to the point where we became aware of our own vulnerability. And that was the birth of self-consciousness. Now, one of the things that's very interesting in Genesis is that Genesis portrays the emergence of self-consciousness as something so profound that it produced a cataclysmic rift in the structure of being. You know, and now, of course, whether or not you believe that depends on what you think of as being. But the idea, I mean, you think about the relationship that human beings have with being. I mean, first of all, we don't really see ourselves as part of the natural world. We see ourselves as somehow separate from the natural world. And we also see ourselves, it's so funny because most modern people believe that the doctrine of original sin is an absurd doctrine. But I don't think I've ever met a modern person who isn't fully convinced of the doctrine of original sin. I mean, all you have to do is talk to an environmentalist for 15 seconds, and the first thing they'll tell you is that there's something intrinsically corrupt about human beings and that we're running around destroying the planet. I mean, how you can fail to see that as a modern transformation of the idea of original sin is beyond me. The idea that there's something wrong with people is the idea of original sin. So, and do people not believe that? I mean, who in this room feels that they're everything they could be? Or who in this room feels that they're not, in some sense, a fallen being? I mean, I've never met anyone who doesn't fit into that category. The closest you ever get is somebody who's like psychopathic beyond belief, you know. And I mean, people are burdened by their inadequacies to different degrees. But virtually no one is secure enough to stand forth as the flawed being they are and say, well, everything's the way it should be with me. So how the hell do you account for that? Now, I don't exactly know what the situation is, but it seems to me, so one of the things that happens, I'll get back to the tree in a minute, is that the serpent tempts Eve, first of all, to eat the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which is quite interesting. So it's the knowledge of good and evil. So there's two trees, right? There's the tree of life and there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's not good and bad, it's good and evil. And it's the serpent that tempts Eve to take the fruit. Okay, so we've already talked about the potential role of the serpent in the development of visual apprehension and the fact that human beings' cognitive structure is primarily visual and that we have the best visual system of any primate on the planet and a better visual system than anything but birds. And that that's tightly tied with our ability to see, and that the fact that we can see and pay attention appears to be tightly tied with our ability to detect our own vulnerability. I mean, it's a pretty coherent story.